can't push over, then that's telling you something. Like that big one right over there, you see it leaning there.
Yeah.
He's not going to bend a tree like that. But this here...
Dick, he snapped this one off. Look at that.
Yeah, he sure did.
There's the end of it.
Yeah, this one, or here's another one. One of these two probably belong on there. You can see that maybe both of them might have been a fork there or something. I pay a lot of attention to especially straight twigs snapped off.
Yeah.
Because I think it has a lot to do with tine length. Bucks with short tines very seldom break stuff off. It's real interesting, Ed, to when you find these kind of things, because I feel like, especially on a straight one, like this here, you know, where you don't have forks, for a buck to break that, normally you take a buck that's just got normal, straight, small tines and all, he'll push on it and he'll twist it, but if he's got normal spacing on it between his points on his beam, he's going to have a hard time breaking that. And every time I found a lot of this, there's been a real exceptionally long time buck in the area. And what happens when he's in here rubbing, he gets these things in between these points here, and when he twists his head, he can snap them off. But on short tines, that thing will slip out between the tines, and he won't break them. But that's interesting on this scrape right here. This is a very typical spring scrape, and the way to find them a lot is from this. 98% of all your scrapes are either going to have something overhanging or something in front of it. The preorbital gland that's right in the front of the eye on a deer, he likes to work his horns over a scrape, and he likes to rub that preorbital gland on something, and it leaves a waxy secretion on there that identifies that as being his own particular scent. And I think it's a little bit of territory marking, although bucks are not territorial. The significance of scrapes is that it shows you that there's bucks in the area.
Okay.
I put less emphasis on locating a particular set of sheds from scrapes than I do from rubs, because bucks start making rubs where they live. They have a certain area they live in year-round. And as he travels in that area, in that travel pattern, he makes these rubs. Scrapes only come into play for about 30 to 45 days as it gets real close to the time that the does are coming into estrus. And you can see, already we see a lot of good rubs in here. And I pay a lot of attention to rub densities. And we ought to just, so people understand what a rub density is, we probably ought to start counting some of these, so you can actually see how many's in a specific area. But
sounds good.
Okay, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4 right over there.
There's one right here, Dick.
5, 6. This is really a large one right here. Probably can't. He rubbed this side up real good, and good height on it also.
Dick, this rub here is the biggest one we've seen of any of them. Does that make a difference size-wise of the tree they rub?
I think it makes a great deal of difference. Now, you'll see a lot of rubs like on some of these that they're inch in diameter, 1.5 inches. That's definitely a good-sized rub. Probably, what would you say, about a 4-inch diameter, 5?
Yeah, at least.
On the tree.
At least.
And you can see gouge marks all up in here where his tips of the tines have skinned it up real good. You can see from even years past. And we'll generally find that traditional areas where bucks have a high concentration of use will be used year after year and forever. Getting back to our rub densities, now we ended up where we have 6, and you can see 2 on that tree.
Yeah.
It was 8.
There's 3 right there in a group right over there.
Yeah, we got about 8, 9, 10. We got 10 rubs, and there's another one over there. We got about 11 rubs right here in a 30-yard diameter area. And that would be classed, what I would class as a rub concentration. Okay. Now here's a tremendous rub here, boy.
Wow.
Big bucks in this country. Look back there. This is really interesting. You can see all these gouge marks back here, all the way down into here. You can see where he's dubbed this off even down here.
Dick, these look like these were made unintentionally. What is this little
the significance of this is you can see he's not going to push that tree very much at all. That's a rigid, stiff tree. And a buck that does this, it shows he's got a good size rack on him. Now, generally, I found it means that he often has long tines, or at least one long tine on the side that does that. A normal buck, by the time you brought his beam around here and brought his antlers out here, if he didn't have some long tines and a pretty substantial rack on him, he just wouldn't be doing that. It's not, again, like a lot of other things about this, every one of them is not 100% conclusive, but after you see enough, you start to get patterns, and pretty soon, you know, it becomes very apparent. You can see it's got the ideal conditions here. You've got a meadow and thick cover all around the border. You got evergreens, and you got security, you got feed, you got everything right here. And they really prefer these fringe areas right here. As you've already seen, what walking we've done so far here, you can see all these rubs and scrapes all the way around the perimeter of this thing.
Right.
And you'll notice that most of them are just inside, right on the edge and inside. They don't tend to use the clumps out in the open so much as they do to remain near the cover. They don't, big bucks, just by the nature of the animal, don't like to expose themselves more than they have to.
They're pretty nocturnal too, aren't they, these big bucks?
Not so much in this country, but generally speaking, very much so. Most places, especially where there's hunting pressure, but where it's very intense. But here, you don't get a lot of hunting pressure per square mile, and consequently, you get a pretty good movement during the day. But and you'll find a trail running just inside this thing, inside the timber line there, about 20 to 30 yards, and it'd be treated much the same as a field, agricultural field in a populated area, where your fringe trails will stay inside. The bucks like to stay inside just far enough that they can see out, but something outside cannot see them inside. This here, you can get a little idea right here from this viewpoint of what happens on these travel patterns, these trail patterns, this network of trails. And it's very important to understand that regardless of where you hunt or whether it's agriculture country or not, to understand that these trails all link little core areas together. They link breeding areas, they link feeding areas, bedding. All these things are linked together. And anywhere that I've ever been, including the mountains or even any place that has low hills, deer prefer to bed on knobs and ridges as opposed to the flat. Getting back to this travel trail network, what I would expect to see here is, you can see this perimeter down here. You'll have your trail just inside. You'll have lots of trails down there going in all kinds of directions. And where the cover joins other cover, you're going to find heavy trails going in and out of there on each end of this thing, and wherever joins other cover.
Through this end area here,
right,
where the swamp cover is continuous with
right,
the south-facing cover.
Mm-hmm.
And then
right
the same
there
on this end over here.
Right. And what you're going to see there is when this trail comes out and starts up these side hills like this, you're going to have vertical trails. And they'll go up pretty much vertical till they get to some of the benches up in here, and you'll start finding good bedding areas. And the way you'll generally tell is when they get up there, then they'll turn horizontal. Most of the trails will follow benches, and when you get to those horizontal trails, that marks bedding areas.
Yes.
And it's very obvious in this country, and even in country like in Canada and places where I've hunted that have low hills in there, you'll have the same thing, except there you'll have the bedding areas right on the tops of them and just off of the downwind side. In other words, if you've got a mountain running like this and a wind coming over it like this, bucks prefer to lay on the back side of it so they can see down below them what they can't smell, and they're smelling anything that comes up, approaches from the other side.
There are certain record-class bucks that will score over 170 Boone and Crockett points and which will never show themselves for any reason, doe in heat or not. They are hyper-cautious and super reclusive. And that may be why each of us keeps the fire in our gut burning. Maybe one cold November day we'll catch him in a compromised situation. Because white-tailed deer are so popular and so widely hunted, there have been many more hunting theories, styles, and techniques presented discussing whitetail hunting than just about any other subject in the outdoors. Whitetail hunters live in nearly every geographic location in the U.S. and come from all sorts of economic, ethnic, and social backgrounds. How are whitetail hunted? What common denominators are there? We are now going to show you, under authentic hunting situations, the 4 best techniques to take whitetail deer. These are deer drives, horn rattling, still hunting, tree stand hunting. Drive hunting must involve a minimum of 2 hunters and up to as many as 6. The idea is simply to have the drivers walk through an area known to hold deer and attempt to push the spooked deer past 1 or more hunters, strategically placed overlooking the expected exit routes of the driven deer. The hunters on stand are placed at vantage points overlooking as much country as possible, but within shooting distance of main travel routes or expected escape routes. This hunter, looking for a trophy, allows this small buck to pass. The driver, emerging from the brush, ends the hunt. Deer can appear suddenly and unexpectedly, sometimes so shaking the hunter he misses. And sometimes the deer are passed over. Antler rattling as a hunting method has come into vogue in recent times. Rattling may be defined as a mimicry of 2 bucks fighting with the thought of luring a 3rd buck into shooting range. Gene Wenzel will discuss the techniques with us.
Gene, I've heard a lot about rattling whitetail, but I've never had anybody demonstrate how to do it, or what you do, or what type of horns or anything. Can you give us a little bit of information?
You bet, Gary. Rattling it's getting to be the big thing. It's getting to be a very popular hunting technique, and unfortunately there's a lot about it that a lot of guys don't understand, and simply because it's been around for years, but just in the past several years is it being utilized in any great extent, and there's a lot of guys doing it wrong, and there's a lot of guys seemingly think they have to do it a certain way. They're making it a whole lot more complex than it actually needs to be. Essentially, rattling is calling, and it's no different than calling elk, calling coyotes, calling ducks. It's a calling technique. Sometimes it's going to work, and sometimes it's not going to work. Under the right conditions, done right, in the right time of year, it works like a charm. And it's just like going out with a varmint call. You might make 6 calls and not have any response, and then on the 7th time you might have 2 or 3 different coyotes come in. If the situation is right and the conditions are right, done right, it'll work every time. Okay, anyways, basically there's numerous factors or several factors that you have to take into consideration when you are rattling. First of all, the buck-to-doe ratio is very important. And this is probably more important than anything. You have to have competition among mature bucks. You cannot expect to rattle. I sell rattling antlers to people all the time, and I sell them in states where I really, you know, I'll get letters from guys that say, you know, I tried rattling, but it didn't work for me or whatever, in other words. And in an area where there's no competition among mature bucks, it's not going to work. Essentially, it's just everybody likes to fight, you know. I ask myself, why did this buck come in and so forth? That's another very important factor as far as deer responding to rattling and so forth. Whitetails are a moody animal, and there again, I'm a fisherman, and I equate a lot of this to fishing, you know, but if they're a moody animal, and you can put like a trout, you can put a fly over top of a trout one day, and he'll completely ignore it, and you can put that same fly, same size, same pattern, over top of the same trout the very next day, under the same weather conditions, same time of day, and he'll smash it, you know, and they just, you know, depend upon the mood they're in. The first initial clash there, again, I've never timed it. I usually do the first sequence probably 45 seconds to a minute. If I had to time it, it'd be somewhere in there, 45 seconds to a minute. Okay, now, then I usually wait about a minute, okay? Then I do another sequence, not quite as loud, but still plenty loud, and I do that about the same, about 45 seconds to a minute. But that time, what you want the deer to do is to get a line on you. Now, usually if they haven't showed up after the second sequence, I'll wait about 4 or 5 minutes, and I'll take it for granted that the deer is in the area and just hasn't pinpointed me quite yet. Then I'll do a third sequence, and I'll do that one much quieter than I do the second or the first sequence. I'm taking it for granted the deer is very close, and he can hear quite well, and I want him to entice him and yet not give him away my exact position. Anyway, bang them together like that, initial clap, then and you go on.
About 45
you
seconds,
go on for that for about 45 seconds, something like that. Now, here again. Now, if I'm on the ground, which you know, ideally, like I say, if you're on the ground, I do it on my knees. You're constantly, you know, I'm constantly in dry leaves. This isn't very noisy because it's damp out here today, and it's fairly. But the whole time, in other words, you're rattling like this. You can run up and down trees like this, stomp the ground, kick your feet behind you like this the whole time, and you can't actually make too much noise and so forth. Pull them apart and just picture two bucks fighting. At the same time, I'll go do one of them. You can make some vocal sounds like they're out. It's not really. They're out of breath, and they're fired up, and it's just, you know, they're steam and so forth coming out there, you know, and they're just anyway. You want to make it as aggressive and as action orientated as you can the first time.
Still hunting is hunting in the purest form. It is a solo sport, and, in a way, still hunting done well is an expression of an individual's personality and his appreciation of a total outdoor experience. Very few people are expert at it. Done properly, still hunting takes extreme discipline, self-control, and mental skill to interpret what is going on around us. White-tailed deer are probably the most difficult big game species in the world to still hunt. But taking a mature buck this way is a very rewarding experience. Still hunting may be defined as a method of hunting by which the hunter attempts to move through an area as quietly and unobtrusively as possible, while maintaining a razor's edge of alertness in order to spot game before he himself is detected. The accomplished still hunter will suffer many frustrations practicing his trade. These failures must be accepted as a learning experience. A still hunter isn't a person who wanders heavy-footed at random through the woods without a feel for the environment around him, hoping for a snapshot at a white flag. This sportsman was skilled enough still hunter to collect his buck despite the forest floor being covered with dry, crackly leaves. He used his eyes and brain to read the sign and thus overcome the buck's superior ears and nose. One must have the utmost confidence that deer are in the area to be hunted. This raises our confidence levels so that the levels of concentration necessary to still hunt successfully are there. Familiarity with the terrain and deer movement patterns are also critical. Moving slowly is another key. Depending on conditions, moving quietly ahead for 2 minutes and standing looking for 10 to 12 minutes may be necessary. One should move ahead only when every particle of real estate has been examined within visual limits. Remember to look for parts of deer, a throat patch or piece of antler. It isn't often that an entire animal will be seen. Still hunting done properly is exhausting work, both physically and mentally. It's a good feeling to get so emotionally wrapped up in trying to find a buck first. Gene Wenzel once commented, "After finishing a session of still hunting, I feel like a limp noodle completely drained. It's a good feeling because I know I've hunted right." Tree stand hunting is the most effective way to harvest white-tailed deer, particularly the bigger, craftier bucks. Why is this so? One reason is white-tailed deer, if not unduly disturbed, are predictable, using the same bedding, feeding, and travel lanes day after day. Therefore, a stand can be set up after studying the situation, and the deer can be caught making his rounds. Second, it is the only way to hunt white-tailed deer and somewhat neutralize their acute sense of hearing, smell, and sight. If those three areas can be regulated or controlled, the hunter has a tremendous advantage. Finally, a tree stand affords a good view. Being above the brush gives the hunter a terrific advantage. A good line of sight can be had for 360 degrees and extending out some distance, depending on ground cover. Gene will now review some of the finer points of tree stand hunting.
Okay, Gary, when you do place a tree stand, you get the platform exactly where you want. You want to keep in mind game movement patterns. You want to keep in mind your shot opportunities. You want to keep in mind that try and place, if possible, an ideal situation is where you have the wind going with you. In other words, you're playing the wind as far as game movement, and also if you can keep knowing where the game should be, if you can keep the sun behind you, it's a big advantage. You know, if they have to look into the sun, it blinds them, so forth. You know, so anytime most of the time you actually can't take advantage of everything, but wind comes first, game movement patterns and so forth come first. But if you can ideally put it in, utilize the sun placement, you know, let's say on an evening stand. Now, certain stands I place for morning hunting, other stands I place for evening hunting. That's another thing. I don't like to hunt the same tree stand 2 nights in a row. In other words, 2 evenings, let's say. The deer will develop a pattern of you going, if you go to the same tree stand in and out the same way 2 and 3 nights in a row, by the 3rd night or even the 2nd night, they're inclined to get a pattern on you, in other words. So I would rather have alternatives where I'm hunting this stand tonight and another stand a mile or a half mile away some other, tomorrow night, and then come back to this stand day after tomorrow and so forth. My tree stand height is usually, my platform height from the platform to the ground averages about, I've been getting higher every year, and it's probably 18 feet now. It used to be around 14, 15 feet. And the deer are noticing me more and more. They're getting smarter every year it goes by. They're looking up more and more, and I'm inching up. To be frank with you, I'm a little bit afraid of heights. And the higher a guy can get and still keep in the vital area on a deer, if you're shooting with a bow and arrow straight down, you can't do it. The angle on the vital organs is too steep, in other words, So I usually try, I would say probably 18 to 20 feet is max with a bow and arrow. The advantages of a tree stand, first of all, you're out of their normal line of sight, the level of sight. They will look up, like I said, but normally their eyes will scan ground level. Secondly, your scent is up higher, where your scent usually blows over top of the deer. Okay, now this is a tree. I'm going to kill a buck out of that tree right there, and I'll tell you why. Now again, this is north here. The deer are going to be headed out from the feeding area, headed across this way, and they're going to either swing down through this thick, there's a low spot here, maybe you can't see it, but there's a low spot here, pretty swampy, and there's a heavy trail coming out right here. This tree is ideally located. First of all, you got the sun behind you. Secondly, you got a lot of brush around the tree for back cover. You don't want to set up a tree stand where a run goes straight. In other words, a straightaway run is not a good place to put up a tree stand. Ideally, you want to put up the tree stand on a curve or just inside of a curve in a run, in a deer run.
Let's accompany Gene on an early morning hunt in Montana's Bitterroot Valley. Gene had thoroughly scouted the area. He knew the deer would gather in a stand of cottonwoods before crossing the river to feed in an alfalfa field. His stand is placed so the deer would cross beneath it. Gene remains motionless as the herd emerges from the river. He draws his bow when the buck drops his head. After hitting the buck, Gene waited for an hour before beginning to track him. Unfortunately, as is often the case in the mountains, a sudden snowstorm swept in and made tracking a difficult challenge. Through diligence and careful work, Gene was able to collect his trophy.
All right.
Normally much more of an open
In a
tree.
second situation, Paul Brunner harvests a spike buck to eliminate this inferior animal from his herd.
Really super good whitetail birdie.
Paul has placed his stand about 18 feet up a large ponderosa pine overlooking an area commonly used as a feeding site by the spike. Paul patiently waits as the spike moves in. Even though the spike looks up, it fails to recognize Paul as danger. Paul draws.
There's blood right here and hair. Well, we got a good blood trail here. He's really spraying it out. The arrow went completely through him, broke off. He'll leave a good blood trail. Well, it looks like he's down. He's done for. A little spike and his one horn is broken off. There's just a tiny little piece of it right left.
A great psychological advantage is enjoyed by the tree stand sitter because he knows he has a good chance of seeing a deer first and can prepare to shoot while the unaware deer is still at a distance. However, a slight variation of the tree stand is a ground stand. In this situation, the hunter chooses a vantage point at ground level where he suspects a deer will pass or come to feed. Wind strength and direction is much more critical here than in a tree stand. For several evenings, Rob Hazelwood has watched 2 good bucks follow a group of does to feed in an alfalfa field. His plan is to place himself at a vantage point before the deer leave the willow cover to feed. His shot will be about 250 yards. More and more does filter into the field, accompanied by a single buck. Finally, a dominant buck comes in and scatters the does as he checks their state of estrus. Rob, from his resting position, takes careful aim at the largest buck. The buck is hit. And separates himself from the others as he bolts for cover. Rob finds the buck less than 50 yards into the willows.
This is a real good example of a mature 5-point whitetail buck. He's fairly even. He's got a little bit of deduction on this side here. The main beam isn't quite as long, and as you can see, the last tine here is a little bit longer than this tine, so he'd lose a little. He's also got a very interesting tine down here that would actually be a deduction tine. About 70% of the score when you're scoring whitetails is scored from your actual points here and the length of them. About 17% is scored from the mass of the antlers, and about 12% is scored from the inside spread. Now this buck here will probably score right around 150. When you do score a whitetail or any animal, you draw an imaginary line from right about this point here using the main beam as your guide. You take your tape and measure from that imaginary line and go right up to the top. This point right here will go right about 8 inches. This point here will go just about 10 inches. Your brow tines probably will be about 6 inches. Actually, they're 5.5. And your inside spread on this buck is going to go about 17.5 inches.
The previous hunting scene was filmed on a ranch in central Montana that Rob manages for Big Buck Production. He will share some thoughts with us about that.
There's really 3 things that we're real concerned about when managing for trophy whitetail. Number 1 is age of our animals. Number 2 is the genetics. And number 3 is nutrition. Nutrition is probably the most important thing we're looking at right now. In these northern latitudes like this, nutrition is very important to get our bucks and does to overwinter in good shape, and so they have good antler development the next year. Genetics is probably the least important of all of the 3 things I mentioned. However, we do game cropping through legal harvest by harvesting does, and also some of our smaller bucks, our older bucks that may not look like they'll make much anyway. We'll go ahead and allow the harvest of them. ultimately we're after the big whitetails that will score 140 Boone and Crockett points and up. Well, there she is, Scott.
Oh, yeah.
That's a nice big adult doe.
Yeah,
Excellent.
look, there's where I hit her.
Yeah, you made a very good shot right there.
Right in the chest there.
Good going. Congratulations.
All right, thanks.
Harvesting does is an important element in Rob's management program.
Yeah, here she is back in here.
Yeah,
again.
good. Yeah, good. There she is.
Yeah,
She dead for sure. Let's watch.
yeah. Yeah,
She's not breathing. Her eye isn't moving.
No, she's a nice big doe.
Yeah, good one. About how old do you think she is, Rob?
I don't know. Let's have a look here. The way you age these things, Gary, is looking at their lower jaw
Yeah.
and checking out the tooth wear and the amount of staining.
What teeth?
That's exactly right.
She didn't have hardly any
This
left.
doe hardly has any teeth. Her teeth are just worn down. She's a real old doe. I'd say maybe 9 or 10 years old.
Was that right?
Yeah. You notice here she's non-lactating. She didn't have a fawn with her, and there's a dry doe essentially, and she's pretty much served her purpose. And really, right now, it'd just be competing against the younger deer coming up. And
Right.
so this is a good one to harvest. You made a nice shot.
Good. Thanks.
Good deal.
No matter where you hunt, being able to interpret what you see is the backbone of successful whitetail deer hunting. It takes a commitment of time and practice, but will eventually bring success. Gene Wenzel presents an interesting theory about successful whitetail hunting. He said that to be the consummate whitetail deer hunter, we must begin to think and act like a predator. We must fine-tune our senses, such as eyes, ears, and smell. And most importantly, we must learn everything we can about how our prey behaves and use our superior intellect to outsmart him. Good hunting.
Hi, I'm Bob McGuire, walking in the Ohio woods. It is now springtime, prime time for deer scouting. Remnant indicators of the fall rut, that's the breeding season, often persist for months. Rubs on trees, scrapes on the ground. All that sign is here now for the hunter to scout for months after the deer has made it. We're going to show you some techniques in the next hour or so. Advanced whitetail hunting techniques, new behavioral traits just discovered by the research biologists. And where do we start? With a topographic map. I'm holding in my hand the key that saves advanced hunters weeks in the field by investing hours at home. Invest in topo maps. In this area, for instance, by looking at this topo map, I discovered this to be the west end of an east-west ridge. That's important to me. Bucks especially favor a nose wind. In fact, the bucks I hunt establish circular junket routes. In the morning, I've found that bucks may go with a nose wind. In fact, they appear at times, especially in heavily pressured areas, a lot of hunting pressure, to require a nose wind, whereas a lot of the deer, does, small bucks, may establish feeding areas, bedding areas, a linear pattern, back and forth. That old buck that leaves a deep foot track and on top, occasionally on top of all those little back and forth tracks, normally is going one direction when he passes through an area. Here again, the topo map helps the hunter. Once you go into an area, because the topo map drew you into an area like this with the east-west feature, look for the pass-through direction that's most common of the oldest, biggest buck, the one with a big foot, and then establish little arrows. As we're going to show you shortly, it's soon easy, after a few pieces of the puzzle fall together, to solve the entire riddle. A few arrows on a map will pinpoint to the hunter daybreak or logical evening intercepts for later hunting. The cornfield out there during the hunting season was still standing, an excellent food source, so that then was a feeding area. And if you look around, all the ingredients to allow all of the deer a secure evening approach are here. The west end of an east-west ridge. In areas such as this with prevailing westerly winds, the deer march right down the ridge, and at the base, there is the feeding area. There's creeks. Out there, there are hedgerows. There are many, many ways for a deer to get in here securely. But the deer I'm after won't come back this way in the morning. They'll all go in this way in the evening, and this is where I'll be. But the big buck I'm after, the one that establishes a circular junket route, at daybreak, he'd be going out the other side during the normal wind direction times. That junket buck, I would hunt on the other side. Hunter location is critical, and tree stands should normally be set high, as the deer in the evening will be coming down this ridge with a nose wind. Looking carefully back there at that tree stand in the general layout, you can see that it's set more or less in a crosswind direction. With that north, the wind normally comes sweeping up here, and the thermal draft during the daylight before the sun sets tends to pull the wind right up this way. And if the deer are coming down the ridge, the hunter is more or less crosswind as they walk by. That also enables a hunter to set up a ground blind in certain situations. And I remember filming Noel Feather in just such a setup. There was a soybean field on a high plateau with a valley off of it running in an east-west direction. And Noel was set up on the ground with me filming over his shoulder, and we had some real excitement as those bucks walked with a nose wind in the valley, yet a crosswind to Noel. He was up high, and the thermal, the evening or the daylight thermal pulled the wind uphill toward Noel and away from the deer. As you see here, the deer were alerted by the sound of my camera, and they ran. Noel waited until the deer stopped running and shot right there. His buck is in the lower left of this picture. Now that's a happy hunter. Noel Feather is the only man to ever kill 3 Boone and Crockett bucks, 2 with his bow. Noel got a good shot on that buck after the deer stopped running. Right now it's March, and of course hunting season's long been over. But some 2 months ago, I came here with Joe Coolis, a friend of mine, and I showed him some of the things you look for in trophy deer hunting. We even found a licking branch. There's a soybean field over that next ridge. I remember walking along this fence row. Joe Coolis learned some special things, some chemical communication that is present all throughout the winter and summer, all year long. This licking branch communication was discovered by me in Ohio and Tennessee a few years ago. We're going to show you some footage now that was taken some 2 months ago when I brought Joe here. Look at the shavings on top of the leaves. That tells you that it was after the leaves fell, of course.
Now this looks like a rub from a really big buck, huh?
Yeah, and in fact it was. You can determine that. I'm feeling the bark now, or the meristem of the tree, and you can determine sometimes the age of the rub. We can see immediately that because of the shavings on top of the leaves, it was made recently. Some trees, like pine trees, will hold a sticky nature long after the rub was made. This tree species does not, and you can determine that it was fairly fresh from the feel of it. You can see in front of the tree where the buck stood in one place. Although big bucks normally pick on big trees, so do small bucks. And a lot of hunters are misled by a rub similar to this that's been made by a spiked buck. They'll come up to a brick wall, something dead flat, and they'll start gouging it with these vertical stripes, and they'll just do a vertical rubbing, deep gouging rubs, as you see here. Well, how do you tell that from a little buck? That's an obvious question. You can see how the buck stood in one place, not only gouged this with his eyebrow tines, but reached around it. Boy, there's some really deep ones here. And then, of course, the horizontal ticking, where he reached around the tree and then pulled his antlers back. These little marks, the horizontal marks, are the best indicator that it was, in fact, a big buck.
Isn't he also doing this to take velvet off his horns at certain times of the year?
Well, the antlers, when they shed velvet, it's because the testosterone is up in the blood. And although they sometimes do interact with trees, the process of velvet removal normally takes place against brush or against high grass, sometimes just sort of falls off. There may not be any itchy sensation. Rubbing takes place any time a buck does not have velvet on his antlers, and that means he's in rut. He's potentially able to breed.
So they're never doing this when they're knocking velvet off their horns?
Never say never, but the main mechanism of velvet removal is not tree rubbing. When biologists have observed, and whenever I've photographed the event, it's been interacting over a short period of time with high grass, and it just leaves tattered remnants around the bases of the antlers, which is what causes velvet to accumulate at the bottom of the early rubbed trees. They have these tattered remnants, and as we said before, they're marking their forehead. That's why a big buck will never come up to a huge tree and rub, but he's got to get his forehead up to it. When you see a really big tree rubbed, it's normally from a smaller buck, and you see evidence from the vertical slashes and the lack of horizontal ticking marks.
And a big deer couldn't get his rack around it, so he's not going to go up to a big tree.
Exactly. A really big tree, a buck purposely rubbing will want to hook around it. If he has antlers big enough to hook, he'll choose a tree that he's able to hook around. The tattered remnants of velvet at the base of a tree does not indicate necessarily the buck was rubbing the velvet off, removing the velvet by rubbing the tree. It indicates instead that the velvet was the tattered remnants of velvet were at the antler bases and then got wiped off as he marked his forehead and worked his antler bases.
Very, very interesting. Rut is really over, at least I think it is, but this rub here seems like it's fresh.
That's true. Technically, the rut is indicated by the buck's ability to breed. Whenever the testosterone blood content is high enough for breeding, the buck is in rut. Rubs occur all throughout the rut, not just at the beginning, at the time of velvet removal. Here it is in early January. The bow season is still in Ohio, and you have rubbing. The rubbing can take place until February or March. In fact, there have been occurrences because the bucks are actually concentrating on their forehead marking. Bucks have been observed rubbing without antlers, following antler casting. The rut, or the breeding season, starts sometime in late August. It starts earlier in northern latitudes. Here in Ohio, the peak of rut, that short time span of roughly 2 weeks long, during which most of the successful breeding takes place, it occurs in the first half of November. Cold weather seems to creep into most hunters' discussions of the rut. Frost, temperature, and all sorts of witchery are viewed as important contributors to that annual event. A basic understanding of rut logic will dispel many of these myths. Postnatal fawn survival in northern climates is enhanced by early season fawn birthing. These young deer are thereby allowed maximum development time, with increased odds of becoming robust and healthy prior to their first winter. Through this selective advantage, deer in these environs have apparently adapted over many generations to synchronize their rut earlier in the fall as compared to whitetails in southern locales. Photoperiodicity, that's the length of days, triggers a series of complex internal chemical changes which cause estrus in does and an increase in testosterone, the male sex hormone, in bucks. Estrus does and rutting bucks, then, are triggered into their condition by the length of days. A few days prior to ovulation of a female, the hormone level of progesterone decreases as the levels of estrogens increase. At this time, she smells right and begins to feel right. Tending bucks might locate and follow her until her increasingly passive responses to their advances results in copulation. If she is not successfully bred, she will undergo these internal hormonal changes on about a 26-day cycle. There are a number of bucks in here. Here's a great.
Now here, isn't one here pretty fresh?
This looks like a fresh scrape. Would this be something that you'd want to spend some time at?
It's a good huntable scrape. If you look at this very closely, you can see where the buck has mouthed this and broken it off. The branch comes out, but it did not droop down. The bucks really need something drooping down toward the ground because they're marking their forehead gland, and they actually come underneath it, lick and nuzzle it, and mark it. Normally after they paw the ground.
What about, again, like we referred to on the scrape? Could this determine how big a deer would be by how high or anything like that? Could that be any kind of a lead to what kind of a buck is using it?
We look for the size of the track. In the scrape. They normally leave a prominent singular foot track in the scrape after they finish working. This is too muddy to see the track. The branch is the most important part of the scrape to the buck, and the buck is important to me, so I never hunt scrapes without that overhanging branch. And if it does not show fresh nibbling, I don't bother to hunt it. This is on the edge of a field, and a lot of people think that the best scrapes are way into the woods. True, along the edge of the field, you do have a lot of pause scrapes where the buck hangs up in the early rut, and he may be starting to tingle. The rut sensations are making him feel right. So when he stops in the evening, the other deer feed out. That old buck may not want to commit himself to the open immediately. And while he's milling around, he may do some of the thrashing, the rubs we saw back there, and he'll also do a little scraping, pawing, without the overhanging branch.
Okay, but that's not as good as
when
this.
he goes, no, that's not huntable. When he goes out of his way, he'll go to a marking location where he can mark with a forehead pheromone, that external hormone. That's what makes a huntable scrape. And hunters who walk into the woods are walking past a lot of bad scrapes and are usually walking past the most important hunting opportunity. Most of the best scrapes, hunting scrapes, are actually on the edge of a woods.
What about time of day? Is this something he would hit early in the morning or late in the evening?
It depends on the rut activity. As rut progresses, there are more estrus does, more does in heat. He spends more of his time looking for what rut is all about, looking for a receptive doe, and he can be seen at any time of the day coming into, especially in wet weather like this. This is ideal weather. A lot of hunters stay home, or they may wait until the rain stops and then head for the woods. That's when the buck is heading there too. You don't want to be on a collision course with a buck. You want to get there ahead of him. So you ought to tough it out all day long in wet weather especially. And during the rut, we marathon. We get into a tree every legal minute. Any place, any time. Rut is rut. Although the deer may pattern different in different habitats during the rut, find a good spot, sit in it. Don't jump around.
If it's raining, they're not going to be moving, but right after that rain stops, see what
most of their deer do not move in the rain. Most of the bucks do. It seems that they have an overwhelming compassion to go and hit those scrapes. They like to sweeten them up. Perhaps it's the forehead scent, perhaps it's a ground scent, but the bucks do run during the rain.
Now you're saying forehead. there is actually, is that why, you know, you're saying there's a gland on the top of his head that he's marking it with? Is that when on an old buck you'll see that the red color on the top of a deer?
It's discolored. It's darker than the rest of the pelage. It may not be red. It could be red or brown or black. It's
right,
just a
but it is
dark
different.
tug. It's all around the antler bases. And when you see a buck actually rubbing or marking these, you'll see him lick and nuzzle it. The footage we have to show them in a moment. But you also see him marking with the activity all around the antler bases. And just get his head up in here and work it.
Okay. Well, let's take another walk, see whether we can find some more sign. Is this another active scrape here?
Yes, it actually shows less activity on the ground than the scrape we just saw, but it's a dynamite location. You see the branches? They are not just for marking over the scrape. These are licking branches. This is what we call a licking branch location. There's a whole lot of branches drooping down from great height, and the bucks come to this location at all times of the year. There's an all-season scent communication, pheromonal, and that's an external hormone. There's an all-season scent communication between the bucks. Every buck in the woods, whenever he's any place near this location, he'll come out of his way to mark these branches with his special pheromone and his saliva.
How do you know? I mean, at what time of year do you find or locate these licking branches?
They're easiest to locate in the summertime. And if you look carefully, you can see it better from a distance. There's a green patch beneath these branches on the edge of the soybean field. And it was caused by the bucks dancing underneath these branches during the summertime when the soybeans were first coming up. It stopped the bean growth, and the grass replaced the beans after they killed the beans off. That's an indicator now that this was a summertime scent location. I have repeatedly observed forehead marking and branch licking behavior. Histology, microscopic study of tissue structure, performed by Drs. Tom Atkinson and Larry Marchington at the University of Georgia, demonstrated that forehead glands become active on relatively dominant white-tailed bucks as the rut progresses. They determined the forehead to be a scent organ used to anoint limbs, branches, and rub tree trunks with a very important pheromone. That's an external hormone, and it is just as chemically powerful as a hormone is on the inside of the deer. I now search out licking branches for later rut hunting. I've photographed bucks at all times of the year, smelling, licking, and marking low limbs. It amazes me when I watch bucks approaching their licking branches at different times of the year that their behavior is consistent to the slightest detail. They approach in exactly the same manner, pull their forelegs together, and perform a consistent licking, nibbling, and facial forehead marking procedure. It involves the forehead, nose, and chin. They appear in bliss, momentarily oblivious to peripheral activity. That's a good chance for a hunter. I believe that unless an area is later abandoned by estrus does, such licking branches should develop annually into the major scrape locations for attending bucks. In the areas I hunt, I rarely find such hot licking branches in close proximity to doe bedding areas. It appears that they might mark instead those selected areas which will later be favored by rutting bucks and estrus does. This is where the buck activity will probably be concentrated by natural rut and estrus sign later. Purposeful scrapes, those which are usually revisited by bucks, often occur beneath a locally preferred tree or bush species. In preparing mock scrape locations or in searching out licking branches, I cater to that local preference. In the Midwestern agricultural woodlot habitat, such as Ohio, I find many of the best scrapes beneath crabapple trees, often in hedgerows or along fence lines. In deep woods habitats, I find bucks favoring holly or hemlock. It matters little what the local favorite licking tree might be. Just find it and remember it. Be careful if you're trophy hunting, however, as I sometimes notice a tendency of individual bucks to consistently favor tree species which might not be popular with the other local bucks. You should do your scouting for good locations, November rut hunting locations, in the early summer. They never stop licking. May and June is a peak activity, we believe.
So if you found this in June, that's the hot spot to be come beginning of deer season.
Yeah, you can find a location. It may not have any ground scrapes or pawns beneath it. In fact, one of the techniques of verifying that it is a licking branch is to expose dirt. Make like a phony scrape, but that's not what mock scraping is.
Mm-hmm.
Make a tracking pit so you can monitor the deer activity beneath the branch. And it'll be obvious if it's a licking branch. There'll be a lot more than just accidental pass-by activity. You'll see a lot of dancing activity beneath those branches, more or less facing the woods. As the bucks get underneath it and they go through the entire scent marking scenario.
Would that be something they would hit once a day, once a week, or isn't there any time relationship?
No, we haven't determined a time relationship. It's whenever they're handy to the branch. It normally peaks out in the early morning and the late evening in the summertime. But I've seen them at all times of the day. I've shot movies of them at all times of the day approaching a licking branch. Whenever it's handy to them. Because most of their activity, they have an avoidance of the midday activity in their normal behavior patterns, you may not witness too much marking at that time. But it's whenever they're near the branch. They'll go out of their way to mark it. And all the bucks, all times of the year, share this location, even during the rut. Some of the other bucks may come in. If there's a scrape developed beneath a licking branch, the subordinate bucks, the lower ones, the ones lower in the pecking order, may tend to avoid the scrape itself and go to the other branches that are not scraped beneath at that time and mark those branches. The bucks, the dominant bucks, seem to tolerate marking activity on the branches. They do not tolerate scrape activity. And a little buck better not get caught with his feet in the scrape of a big buck.
Very, very interesting. I can see that how that could help a hunter that wants to spend the time to find an area where a big buck is, to take some time in June and go out and find something like this, because come November, he's going to have a chance at a big deer.
You bet. This has made the biggest difference in my personal hunting. Trophy hunters will quickly pick this up. After looking at the movie footage we just showed, that you appreciate now, the most important part of a scrape to the bucks is the overhanging branch. This critter is a source, or is a carrier, of a very important chemical. And that chemistry is especially important during the rut. Now, there's considerable difference between the marking branch overhanging a scrape and a real licking branch. Many people are going to confuse this in their hunting. As I showed you earlier in the footage, the easiest time to scout for the licking branch is in May or June, during the early summer. That seems to be when most of the bucks are doing most of the licking. During the rut, chemical marking is also important, but maybe a different pheromone from a different source. That's yet to be determined. Regardless, scrapes which do not have branches overhanging them are definitely not huntable. I'm often asked how to cancel a scrape. What do you do to turn off the deer, especially the bucks that are coming in regularly to a scrape? Consider yourself walking into the woods and finding some other hunter set up over your scrape hunting your deer. Hunters are possessive. Anybody who's worked so hard for such a good hunting opportunity doesn't like it when somebody else moves in on them. In truth, you don't own the deer. You probably don't even own the land. You should have permission to hunt, of course. But what do you do? When I ask that question back to the hunters, often they urinate in the scrape. And amazing as it may sound, urine, even from a human, even from a carnivore such as a coyote in areas where the local coyotes prey heavily upon the deer, that urine is an attractor to whitetail bucks. Bucks come in and perform fleaming. There's a specialized organ in the roof of a deer's mouth called a vomeral nasal organ, and it's so sensitive, I defy a chemical analyst, a qualitative analyst, to improve upon it. The bucks are so attracted to urine, they can come up to a spot on the rock, lick it, take the urine constituents up in their saliva, and curl their upper lip. They make a fricative, a nasal sound, such as that. because they're partially blocking their nose, the nasal passage, with their lip as they inspire. They suck in. And this creates a negative pressure in the nasal passage upon that vomeronasal organ. Next time you kill a deer, open the mouth and look for that little tiny diamond-like just in on the upper palate, on the top, the roof of the mouth. That's connected to the nasal passage, and when a buck encounters urine, he's attracted to it. And he takes it up into his mouth, performs Fleeman, this lip curl behavior, and then he knows if it's conspecific urine. That means urine from another deer, and if it be, is it from a doe or a buck, juvenile, adult, even perhaps the breeding condition. So what does that hunter do now, who finds somebody else hunting his scrape? He probably goes to the other end of the woods and fashions a scrape so big that you could park a car in it. And this other hunter, you know, the dumb one, he'll haul his 48-pound tree stand all the way over the hill to that other scrape that you made, the phony one, the one you probably urinated in, and he'll hike it up the tree a half a mile away and shoot your deer. You wouldn't believe how many times I've been told that horror story. Urine does not turn off a buck, and pawing the ground randomly does not discourage a buck. In fact, mock scraping has become a buzzword in scent circles. Since I coined that term a few years ago in a magazine article, many other writers have picked up on it. The simple truth that many hunters soon realize who hunt scrapes. The easiest way, perhaps the only way, to turn off a scrape, to cancel a scrape, is to break off the branch. Without an overhanging branch, that isn't a good scrape so far as a buck is concerned. And we use this in many hunting techniques. To cancel a scrape, break off the overhanging branch. I recently learned a lot about sex from a little girl who is dear to me, a little doe. It seems that this doe was so young in its first season that it never attained puberty weight and never experienced estrus as a fawn. The hour hand ticked out, the estrus hour hand, before her minute hand ticked in. The following spring, she was among the fewer fawns who did not experience birth. And without birthing, no lactation, no nursing, she was in extra good condition, extra healthy, the following fall as a yearling. It appears that there's a mechanism to synchronize estrus in the does. It's called a silent ovulation. In fact, the first ovulation has no associated estrus. Biologists have recently verified this. And there's a very short time span and a variable time span between that first ovulation and the next one, which signifies the first real estrus. Estrus is when the doe feels right and smells right. She attracts the attention of bucks. There's a length of time varying between perhaps a few days and 2 weeks or more between the first and the second ovulation. There are a few healthy does, though, who experience an early estrus, and they go on an excursion. Those does that have been radio monitored, telemetry collars have been put on them, and then monitored throughout the rut season, have gone on an overnight excursion, normally well without or beyond their core territory. They go extra far one night of the year when they're looking for the guys. Wherever they go, when they're smelling right and feeling right, they're leaving sign. Early on, perhaps in September, where November is the normal peak of rut, early on, the bucks and the does may not respond to that sign, but they don't appear to forget where they found it. And then, later on, when they do feel right, both the bucks and the does may go back to where they have experienced recently the most estrus sign. And then it's sort of like the chicken and the egg. Either promotes the other, and it doesn't really matter which came first. The bucks promote the does, promote the bucks, promote the estrus does, promote the rutting bucks. I hunt typically for 40 or more hours in a fall in a location that I expect to develop into a hot spot. I hunt long before the bucks show up, and then pretty soon they're there. into an area that has concentrated rut sign. Small kids soon learn, because of their parents or perhaps in spite of them, the easiest way to win a contest is to cheat. This area appears no different than many others